Welcome to our plenary session of uAnalytiCon 2025, Fictional Objects, and let me introduce our first speakers, Professor Alberto Voltolini and Professor Carola Barbero from Università degli Studi di Torino, and the title of the talk is Fictional Characters, Real Interpretation Problems, and Complex Solutions. So, please.
Thank you so much for this invitation to this important conference. It's a pity that we are only online, but hope that we will soon have other opportunities to meet in presence. So our talk has to do with a certain problem that arises once you share a sort of Meinongian framework with respect to what constitutes a fictional character or a fictional entity, because in all the variants of the Meinongian position, at least the set of the properties that are ascribed to a fictional character in the relevant story is a necessary condition for the identity of that fictum. For some variants of the position, it is also a sufficient condition, but for our purposes, it is enough that it is a necessary condition, because the first consequence of this idea is that if one changes even the most irrelevant property that is ascribed to a fictional character in a story, the result is that one gets a different fictional entity. And this might even be the case not only when a word changes, but only when different versions of one and the same work are mobilized, that if such versions to a certain protagonist are ascribed different properties, then that protagonist becomes a different sort of entity. Some people believe that this sort of fragility for the identity condition of a fictum is a sort of defect of the Meinongian position. But one might say that this is a sort of consequence that arises from the fact that it's very hard to individuate if there are essential properties for a fictional character that would enable that character to remain the same. It is quite relative to establish what are the so-called essential properties, and possibly all the properties stand on the same footing. So in this case, if we consider what for Italians is one of the best example of an historical novel, The Betrothed, written by Alessandro Manzoni, if one of the main characters, Don Abbondio, had a sort of different deed, he had not met certain other protagonist of the story, then it would have been a completely different fictional character. And also if, since this work actually was produced in different versions, there is a character that is called Fermo in the first version of the novel, and then a character that is called Renzo in a later version of the novel. And since the names are different, they have the two characters have different properties, and therefore they have to be considered to be different entities. Now, this might arise a certain problem with respect to the properties that are ascribed to a fictional character in a story. There are cases in which the ascription is very easy, because there is an overt explicit ascription of properties in a story, when in the story typically the author writes or says that a character is made or acts in a certain way. There might be cases in which one has to discover what is the right ascription of a property, perhaps because the story is told by an unreliable narrator, as is famously the case of Lolita with Nabokov, in which the main character who also tells the story is well known to be unreliable about that. And also in the case, not only in written stories, but also in depicted stories, it might happen that the properties that are involved are, so to speak, discovered, because simply one does not see carefully or acutely what are the properties that are really ascribed to certain fictional characters, to a certain imaginary individual. This can be the case, for instance, with a very famous movie of the 60s by Michelangelo Antonioni, Blow Up, in which at a certain point one discovers via certain blows up of a certain photograph that one of the characters is actually using a gun against someone else. And then there are also some sort of ascriptions that are made by an author, but covertly, simply because the narrator in that case is using the language in a figurative way. And so one has again to realize what is the property that is ascribed to a certain character, because in point of fact, one has to discover the kind of figurative mechanisms that are involved. This, for instance, is very well known in the case of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, in which since the author speaks with a sort of ironical stance, in point of fact, what she is ascribing to the main characters is not what is explicitly said, but what can be, so to speak, implicated by means of what the author fictionally says, just because the author is speaking in an ironical way. And in any case, here there is no problem with the ascription, because the ascription is simply deduced or deducible via the fact that the author, so to speak, is the last authority in order to decide what are the properties that are explicitly ascribed to a certain fictional character, simply because the author decides or stipulates what are such properties. Of course, the author might have written different things, might have decided to write a story differently. For instance, if we go to the famous case of Madame Bovary, it could be the case that Flaubert wrote the story in a different way by writing that Emma Bovary was not married to Charles Bovary, but then, of course, the character would again be a completely different individual, just because of the fact that the author has so decided. But these are not the only properties that can be ascribed legitimately to a fictional character, because over and above explicit ascriptions, whether overt or covert, there also are implicit ascriptions that work according to many different principles. For instance, you can ascribe a certain character, certain property via what Stacy Friend has called the reality assumption. For instance, when we read the Conan Doyle stories about Sherlock Holmes, we also know that Sherlock Holmes lives in London just because of the fact that the housing where he lives is located in a street, Baker Street, that belongs to London. And so this makes it the case that Sherlock Holmes is a Londoner. Or you can have a different sort of principles that work, for instance, the genre assumption, the assumption that the story belongs to a certain literary genre. Or you can even use a certain sort of inferences that can be either modeled on the Gricean model of implicatures, or maybe are sort of abductive inferences that allows one to, so to speak, ascribe to a fictional character many more properties with respect to the properties that are explicitly ascribed. For instance, to go back to an example that already involves Alessandro Manzoni's masterpiece, The Betrothed, there is a certain character who is a nun, and is explicitly described as a nun, that since she is a human being, of course, she also has the property of having a pancreas, even though, of course, Alessandro Manzoni never wrote in the story, neither explicitly nor overtly and not even covertly, that it is the case. But this is simply something that we can infer via the fact that we use the reality assumption. And this nun has also the property of wearing wool socks, just because of the fact that we mobilize the genre assumption, in sense that the novel is set in the 17th century, and in the 17th century, nuns were used to wear certain sort of socks. And then there are also other inferences that we can make. For instance, we can infer the fact that this nun, Gertrude, also has the property of having an illicit, intimate relationship with another guy described in the story, even though the only thing that Manzoni explicitly says or writes in the story is the fact that this girl, this nun, replied to the greetings of this other character, without saying that they had a sort of love relationship. But this can be surely inferred by what the story further says about these individuals. Another famous example of this situation concerns again Madame Bovary, because at a certain point Flaubert writes of Emma Bovary, Elle s'abandonna, and he doesn't write anything more, but we can surely infer that she was involved with a sort of intimate relationship with another character named Rodolphe, even though Flaubert is not explicit on that side. That's fine. So there are a lot of properties that we can ascribe to a fictional character, and that according to the Meinongian constitute, so to speak, the identity of the character. But there are a lot of other properties on which the story is completely silent, in the sense that we can neither ascribe those properties explicitly nor even implicitly to a certain character. In the famous example, for instance, one might say that Sherlock Holmes, if we wonder whether Sherlock Holmes had or not a mole on his left shoulder, we cannot settle any of the two alternatives, since Conan Doyle is completely silent about that, and we cannot use any principle in order to infer what is the case in this situation. And of course, at this point, a matter of interpretation arises, because one might say, well, look, there may be other properties that can be ascribed to a fictional character, but via the fact that certain critics interpret the story in a certain particular way. And here we are talking of interpretation in the weakest possible sense, according to which the interpretation does not, so to speak, by itself constitute a further content in the story, but simply enables one to ascribe another property to a certain fictional character that is described in the story. But then here the problem finally arises, namely, if it is a matter of interpretation, and suppose that there are conflicting interpretations as to whether a certain character has a certain property that is ascribed in this way or not, do we have to say that according to the different interpretations that are mobilized, since the different interpretations mobilize different properties, then there are two different characters that are involved in the story? This would be a sort of weird and implausible result, because it would amplify, so to speak, the number of the fictional characters even more than the Meinongian framework is disposed to accept, because for any possible different interpretation, we would have to get that since the interpretation mobilizes a different property, a different character occurs in the relevant story. So just to give you some famous example, let's go back to Shakespeare's Hamlet, and suppose that according to a Freudian interpretation, Hamlet is taken to be an hysteric, neurotic person that suffers from the Oedipus complex. This also, this depends only on the fact that you are applying psychoanalysis, so to speak, to that famous character. But There are, of course, other interpretations according to which Hamlet is a perfectly wise person that is merely pretending that he is a mad guy. So, since these interpretations are completely different and ascribe different properties to the relevant characters, are we forced to say, qua Mainongians, that there are two different Hamlet's characters depending on which interpretation one adheres to? Or again, if we go back to the case of the betrothed that we have already spelled out, there are some interpretations according to which the two characters, the nun and her lover, had a sexual intercourse, but according to some other interpretation, they had no such intercourse. They simply shared some powers interests, so to speak, in order to rule the convent and doing other things. And again, are Mainongians forced to say that there are two Gertrudes, two different nuns in the story, depending on the interpretation one adheres to? Well, there is an easy solution for these cases, namely to say that there is just an ideally correct interpretation, right? The interpretations do not stand on a par, do not stand on the same footing. There is one ideal interpretation that is the right one, and then we have to ascribe to a certain character just the properties that are involved by that interpretation. There are merits in this easy solution. That is, this easy solution, for instance, enables one to, so to speak, settle which properties are ascribed to a fiction, to a fictum, in the case in which the story is narrated in a certain way that there is, so to speak, a coup de théâtre. The expectations that one has with respect to a certain character and that one develops while reading the story are simply cancelled or banned via the fact that the story goes in another direction. And this happens in many stories and typically happens in jokes or puns, in which a joke, for instance, is normally made via the fact that one revises a certain expectation at the end of the joke or the pun when one meets the so-called punchline, in which the first interpretation clashes, so to speak, with the new interpretation that results to be the correct one. Just to give you some examples, if we go back to a famous movie by Alejandro Amenabar, The Others, for a long while when you attend the movie, you take that the characters, the main characters, are human beings, but in point of fact, at a certain point of the plot, it turns out that they are ghosts, that they are not human beings. And this is the correct interpretation, because this interpretation easily explains why they regularly meet no people in the story when they get out of the house in which they live, simply because they are ghosts, and so they cannot meet any other person. Or there are, now I won't read it because it's very long, but this is a famous funny joke in which in the end one revises the original interpretation by taking that the guys that are involved do not have an homosexual relation as it originally seems, but they are in point of fact a necrophiliac, because they have a completely different relationship with respect to a dead body. So in this sense, the easy solution might not work, because there are problems with this solution, because it is very hard to decide what are the criteria in order to establish what is the ideally correct interpretation. Who is the authority here? The author, the critics, the reader? Some might say it is the text, but the text is not enough, because as we have seen in many cases, the narrator deliberately leaves open whether the story ascribed to its characters certain properties or not. And indeed, whatever happens in the story is compatible with the idea that such characters have the properties, and also that they fail to have such properties. So in the end, the idea that there is just an ideal correct interpretation does not seem to work. We will give you a famous example again by relying on the famous novel by Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, because in that story, it is very hard to decide whether one of the characters, Miles, has the property of having met a certain ghost, or he is only such that the governess that is involved in the story seems to see that there is a ghost involved in the story, whereas in point of fact, there is no such ghost. So are there ghosts in the story or are there no ghosts? Henry James was very careful, so to speak, in leaving this point completely open. Henry James seems to have written the novel in such a way as to make it compatible with both interpretations. So neither interpretation can, in some sense, be qualified as the ideally correct interpretation, for they stand exactly on a par.
Okay, so in order to find a way out to this problem, let's try to analyze the literary work of art by Roman Ingarden, where Ingarden distinguishes between literary objects, whether works or fictional characters, and seen as schematized objects. What Ingarden says is that the schematized nature of these objects fulfills the synthesis between idealism and realism. This was the big opposition in the late school of Husserl, because the schema is an idealization. This means a formal structure allowing autonomy in respect to concrete characteristics. The schema that here Ingarden has in mind is not the schema of Kant, but it is the schema of Bergson. This means a schema of movement. According to Ingarden, the schema gives a form to the object, leaving inevitably many aspects indeterminate. And these aspects are the ones that are fulfilled, somehow concretized by the reader when appreciating the text. Ingarden writes, what is in question here are certain idealizations, which are, so to speak, a skeleton, a schema of concrete, flowingly transitory aspects. The example given by Ingarden to explain what he means by that is given by the following quote. He writes, in a literary work, only schematized aspects can appear, although in the reading they allow of various actualized aspects. It is frequently the case that represented objects are supposed to portray determinate real objectives. For example, the story in Romain Rolland's novel L'âme enchantée takes place, as we usually say, in Paris. Various streets of the French capital are represented here. Let us assume that given a reader of this novel does not know Paris from his own experience. In reading, it naturally actualizes, among other things, the novel's predetermined aspects of the given streets. However, since he has never concretely experienced these streets in primary perception, their actualization never succeeds in such a way that the contents of the aspects actualized by him could be similar in detail to the aspects, and so on and so forth. Okay, what is important here is that somehow we can introduce a sort of normative aspect of reading or of concretization. When reading a novel about Paris, for instance, if I have been in Paris 3 times, I will recognize the streets and I will visualize correctly what is described. Whereas, for instance, if Alberto has never been in Paris, his concretization will be, I would say, less perfect than mine under a certain point of view. But maybe we will have time during the Q&A to discuss about this. What is important is that when we read, when we concretize, what happens is that we fill these gaps, we fill out what is ontologically incomplete by conceiving it as if it were complete. So when reading, we add those parts that are not present in the schema, in the skeleton. And by adding these parts, we somehow understand, we grasp a more complete meaning of what is told. Ingarden writes that during his reading and his aesthetic appreciation of the work, the reader usually goes beyond what is simply presented by the text, and in various respects completes the represented objectivities, so that at least some of the spots of indeterminacy are removed. Some. It is impossible to fill all the gaps. Okay, the reading process can fill some of these gaps. And this explains why, from a single schematized object of a literary work, for instance, one can derive different concretizations. Okay, my concretization of Madame Bovary is different from Alberto's. And no characterization is identical with the work. Because the work is the skeleton. What happens is that I concretize in my way and he concretizes in his way. So we have one schema, but multiple concretizations. And this distinction is important. This is a point Iser the act of reading particularly insists on, that we always should keep separate the literary work itself, which is a gappy object, from the concretization made by readers. Defending this distinction between the literary work and its concretization does not mean to deny a sort of genuine access to the work itself. This means to defend a position according to which the literary work has a peculiar ontological structure, and this structure is characterized by schematicity that might be fulfilled time after time by readers, but this has not to do with its essential identity, which was our starting point with Meinongianism. Ingarden says that we can say that every literary work is in principle incomplete and always in need of further supplementation. And this specific characteristic, according to Barry Smith, is the one distinguishing literary objects from real ones, because he explains that from an ontological point of view, literary individuals are underdetermined, and whereas real individuals are totally determined from an ontological point of view. Whereas from an epistemological point of view, what happens is exactly the opposite, because we know everything we need to know about literary fiction characters, whereas we do not know everything we need to know concerning real ones. I know everything I need to know about Madame Bovary, because what I need to know is what is written in the text by Flaubert, whereas I do not know everything about Alberto, for instance. So these spots of indeterminacy, these gaps, are what distinguishes real from literary entities. Real objects are ontologically determined completely, whereas literary objects are not. They fail to satisfy the law of the excluded middle, since if they are determined for what concerns a property P, having a mole on his shoulder, it is neither the case that they have, nor is the case that they fail to have P. The example given by Ingarden is the following. It says, if a story begins with the sentence, an old man was sitting at a table, it is clear that the represented table is indeed a table and not, for instance, a chair. But whether it is made of wood or iron, is four-legged or three-legged, is left quite unsaid, and therefore it is not determined. Okay, here the genre usually guides our filling the gaps. For instance, if the novel we're reading is a realistic one, we will assume that this table is made up by iron or wood, and not, for instance, of water or rainbows. This could happen in a fantasy, but not in a realistic novel. Which are the consequences of this? That a fictum is in itself incomplete, and Pace Albrecht, it cannot be grasped via thinner, incomplete objects, for this grasping may happen only as far as concrete objects are concerned, for which incomplete objects may be facets or guises that inner to them. It is not accidental that we have been speaking until now about literary characters and not fictional characters in general, because the literary example is important for us, because this sort of incompleteness depends on the fact that literary characters are grounded, as far as their grasping is concerned, on imagination, which provides incomplete representations of what is about. Whereas if we think about pictorial versions of characters or movies, in those cases, what we perceive is less indeterminate. Because what we perceive, what we have to do with is, I would say, a concretization of the filmmaker or of the painter of that same fictional character. Think, for instance, at the movie version by Tim Fywell of Madame Bovary from the 2000. This is a TV movie of Madame Bovary, where what the filmmaker Fywell tried to do was to concretize, for instance, this description we find in the book written by Flaubert. We find this: she was pale all over, white as a sheet, the kin of her nose was drawn at the nostrils, her eyes looked at you vaguely. You have this version given by Fywell, okay? And for instance, we might have another version, another concretization by another filmmaker. Take this one of 1991 by Claude Chabrol, where the main character, Madame Bovary, is Isabelle Huppert. For instance, this version by Chabrol has been criticized because it seems that Isabelle Huppert, even if she's a great actress, she is maybe too much detached, too much controlled, too much clever for being Madame Bovary. And this explains also why we can criticize the concretization of a filmmaker or of a painter. And that's why we often say, and here Iser strongly insists on this, that's not how I imagined her when we go to watch a movie. Because while when we read the novel, we imagine by ourselves what Emma looks like, that's something we do just by ourselves. That's why also the act of reading is somehow something somehow difficult for readers to do. Whereas when I watch the movie by Chabrol, I watch the version of someone else. That's not my version, that's the version of Chabrol. And the point here is, as Iser says, that the reader is able to visualize the main character for himself, and when the character is offered in a different version, for instance, in the one given by Chabrol, the work of imagination is somehow out of action. It is not completely out of action, because we also need to imagine, for instance, to put in connection one scene with another, or to understand what is not put on the movie, but of course less than what happens when we read the work. Another interesting example to work on is the one given by Brian Joseph Davis, this media artist who has offered this project whose name is The Composites, which is a work working on the police composite sketch software. And what he did was to put into this software the description of the literary characters, and then the software gave out the face, for instance, of Madame Bovary in this case. Somehow this project was, according to me, was doomed to failure, because this software created by the police was supposed to work for real entities and not for literary ones. And what it offered, it was somehow a sort of skeleton or a sort of gappy structure. This face does not look as a real face. Okay. At this point, a quite obvious question could be, but are we always invited to concretize? Is something that the reader is always supposed to do? We would give a negative answer to this question, because it seems that in some, for instance, postmodern work, or the case of Absurd, as the one given here by Beckett, Waiting for Godot, are clear cases where the reader or the spectator is asked to accept the work, the scene as it is, somehow deciding not to feel anything, but just accepting the skeleton, the schema as it is. Think about what happens in Waiting for Godot. Here, we do not even have properly a story. There is the first and the second act, where these two characters, Vladimir and Estragon, are waiting for someone who never comes, not in the first, neither in the second act. Nothing happens. And if we try, for instance, to better understand this work by insisting on the fact that maybe we should grasp the literary allusions of the work, think about Simone Weil's Attente de Dieu, or Honoré de Balzac, Le Faiseur ou Mercader, where we have a main character who is Godot, but written in a different way, not in the same way of Beckett. But I would say that even in those cases, even knowing that maybe these literary allusions are in line with Beckett, no new meaning would be added, and no new property would be added to the two main characters, Vladimir and Estragon. So in this case, what we are asked to do is to leave everything underdetermined. Here there is the famous dialogue between the two, where it comes out that even the characters do not know what they are waiting when waiting for Godot. Vladimir says, "I'm curious to hear what he has to offer. Then we'll take it or leave it." And Estragon asks, "What exactly did he ask him over for?" "Were you not there?" replies Vladimir. "I can't have been listening." "Oh, nothing very definite. A kind of prayer." "Precisely. A vague supplication." "Exactly. And what did he reply?" "That he'd see. That he couldn't promise anything. That he'd have to think it over. In the quiet of his home, consult his family, his friends, his agents, his correspondence, his books, his bank account before taking a decision. It's the normal thing. It is not. I think it is. I think so too. So I mean, they are even the main character do not know why they're waiting for Godot and what do they wait for him. So it seems to me that in such cases, we as readers need somehow respect this indeterminacy. So we need not remove it as we would do in the case of Madame Bovary, when she is described as being pale all over, white, the skin of her nose in a particular way, and so on and so forth. In that case, we are asked to feel what is left blank by the author. Whereas in the case of Beckett, no, this would be a bad way of approaching the work, because what we are asked to perceive and to appreciate is the schema itself, the skeleton. But then if these gaps, the spots of indeterminacy are sometimes to be filled in and sometimes to be left open, how to decide what to do? Not by appealing to an ideally correct interpretation, because there is none, but paying attention to literary genre, for instance. We know that this work by Beckett belongs to the theory of the absurd theater, by the cultural conventions, and by the author's invitations. So the complex solution out of Ingarden is that ficta may have the properties that are ascribed to them within the relevant narrations, either determinately or indeterminately. The ficta are constituted only by the properties that are ascribed to them determinately, namely the properties which constitute their schemas, the one that we find written in the text, but both those explicitly ascribed to them, either overtly or covertly, and those implicitly ascribed to them. And here, of course, reality assumption, genre assumption can guide us. Only when an interpretation becomes stable by virtue of some criteria of interpretation, it determinately yields to a fictum a further property constituting it, so that the property is internally predicated of it. Otherwise, only a property of the kind being P according to the interpretation I corresponds to a property P with respect to which the fictum is incomplete, is merely externally predicated of it. So does the fictum Beatrice love the fictum Dante spiritually or erotically? We have put here fictum because they're real persons as well, but we wanted to insist on the fact that here now we are speaking about fictional entities. Who knows? So neither the property of loving Dante spiritually nor the property of loving Dante erotically constitutes her. So unless these interpretations become stable, they cannot provide further properties to a fictum. Hence, different unstable interpretations do not provide different ficta, but yield to one and the same fictum, for instance, the Ingardinian schema, externally predicated compatible properties of the form being P according to the interpretation I. So one and the same fictum can indeed externally be both P according to the one interpretation and not P according to the other interpretation. So that's it, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. So, are there any questions? No questions? Можешь подходить в штаб.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What do you think about reference to fictional entities, fictional characters? Like, do we have one token of fictional entity, or we have some tokens and one type? Are we speaking about one fictional entity, or we have our versions of it? If you can understand me.
Yeah, do you mean by distinguishing between tokens and type, say cases in which you have a sort of literary cycle in which, say, for instance, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, for instance, in which we have something like a general type Sherlock Holmes, and then the different Holmeses that are involved in the different stories by Conan Doyle. Is this your point?
Is it one Sherlock Holmes or not?
Okay. Well, one might say if one is a Meinongian, there are different solutions to this problem. Either one says that there is a sort of essence that the different Holmeses involved in the different stories share, and that's the only Sherlock Holmes that there is, so to speak. But this sort of solution, as Thomason has pointed out, has the problem that it is very hard to individuate what are the essential properties for this general character. For people might disagree on that. And the other option is to say is a sort of very liberal option, according to which you have all the different characters in the stories, all the single Holmeses, so to speak, and also a general Holmes that is made out of all the properties that are ascribed to these different characters in the different stories. So in this sense, you might get that the general Holmes is just the sum, so to speak, of all the properties that are mobilized in the different stories. There is also a drawback here, which has to do with the fact that it might be the case that the general character becomes a sort of contradictory entity just because different opposite properties are ascribed to the single characters in the stories. As a famous example that is often quoted in the literature, there is the case of Watson, the friend of Sherlock Holmes. In some stories, Watson is ascribed a certain wound in the leg, and in some other stories, he's ascribed that wound in the shoulder. And so the general Watson, so to speak, would have to have the property of having a certain wound both in the leg and in the shoulder, which is a bit contradictory. So there is also this damage.
I would add to this point that maybe this idea of having a sort of general Sherlock Holmes, for instance, having a sort of connection with all the individual Sherlock Holmes written by different authors explains also why when we speak about these different Sherlock Holmes as readers, we say the Sherlock Holmes of the writer Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes of the other writer, and so on and so forth, because sometimes what happens is that we want to distinguish them, even recognizing that they all belong to this general category. We want to distinguish them because, for instance, in one version of Sherlock Holmes of Conan Doyle, this Sherlock Holmes is very brave, and in another is very clever, and in another he assumes so much cocaine, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and another question. If we do accept Meinongian theory of equivocality of existence and being and so on, do we need to differentiate some discourses, fictional discourses about fiction, and like what are truth conditions? Truth conditions of propositions in which we refer to fictional characters. Have you like fictional, metafictional, parafictional, breaking the fourth wall discourse, or like, and what I'm asking this in connection with Meinongian view.
Well, of course, there are different sort of, as you said, there are different sort of statements, fictional, parafictional, metafictional. So the issue of truth conditions depends, of course, of the kind of statement that is involved. If we are talking about, say, external or metafictional statements, such as Holmes was created by Conan Doyle, that's the easy case, because one might say that for a Meinongian, that the property of being created by an author is, for instance, externally ascribed to a certain fictional character. Or one might even say that this property is, as Parsons said, an extra-nuclear property. Maybe the case that is more difficult is the case of parafictional statements, those that do not immediately involve the pretense, because they seem to concern, in a sense, reality, that is not the fictional world, the pretended world, but the real world, in which we have to say that, for instance, when we say in this sense that Sherlock Holmes is a detective, what we mean is that in the story of Holmes, in the Conan Doyle stories, Sherlock Holmes is a detective. And then, of course, there are different modes in order to account for the truth conditions of this sentence that normally, if you are a realist about fictional characters, you have to, in some sense, assume that the character has either internally dedicated properties or in the story properties or nuclear properties. It depends on your account.
But if you accept Meinongian view, do we need to think that the truth makers of these sentences are not only tied up with our concrete world, but with some abstract objects or something like that? Truth makers. They're not only tied with our concrete world.
In which case? In the case of metafictional statements, parafictional statements?
Or you mean just
maybe even fictional.
Fictional objects.
Fictional per se, yeah, in fictional
Yeah,
discourse.
I mean, of course, a Meinongian would say that since reality is not the only element guiding us in ontological decisions, we can accept these as objects that we need to include in our ontological inventory, even if they do not have a spatio-temporal location, of course. Then we admit them as objects, but different, of course, from real objects and different from abstract objects and so on and so forth. We need to explain what these fictional entities are in a Meinongian framework, but we accept them, of course. And when you decide what kind of Meinongian you want to be, then you can explain what these objects are and what kind of, and how to describe the properties characterizing them. If nuclear, exanuclear, if you are a person, if you follow Terence Parsons, or exemplified properties and codified properties, if you follow other, such as Zalta, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I have one short question concerning the fictional character which is intentionally leave in informational gap, like Godot. Can we describe this character by properties that we can presuppose to be in the category of this hero. For example, when we think about Godot, we think about him as a human, and human has 2 legs, 2 hands, and so on. Most of human, and can we think about Godot as a human with 2 hands and 2 legs, despite the fact that there are some humans with only 1 leg and only 1 hand, and if we can, how far can we go in this way?
Okay, thank you for your question. So this is a very difficult question because Godot, as you know, is the missing main character of Beckett's work. So he never appears, and what we know about Godot is just what Vladimir and Estragon tell about him, and or what we know is just that Godot is someone. So it is a person. it is a person, is someone they are waiting. Of course, you ask, so can we assume that Godot is a human? Of course, we can assume that he's a woman and is a human being. And for instance, we put aside all those interpretations going in the direction of, think about those assuming that what they were really waiting was God, okay? Following Attente de Dieu. But it seems that even if it is a god, it has a human appearance. So they're waiting for a human being. Human beings usually have, you said, 2 legs and 2 arms and so on and so forth. But why not supposing that the human being, the two are waiting as just 1 leg? Because I would say, even if the work by Beckett is gappy, there are no elements to suppose that the one they are waiting has such a characteristic, or with different words, there's no way of supposing that such a characteristic would be relevant for the story. So, because when we appreciate and interpret the work, and what the author in this case asks us is to introduce just those elements that are necessary in order to understand the work. And it does not seem that going in that direction of having just 1 leg or 1 arm would help understanding the work. More than this, what Beckett asks us is just not to add anything at all to his work. One could, for instance, suppose that Vladimir and Estragon are totally crazy because they do not even remember why they're waiting for him, for Godot. Or one can ask why they look so miserable, why they look so poor, why are they dressed in that way? I mean, all these questions, maybe one could say, going in the direction opened by Beckett, wouldn't be relevant in order to understand that literary character and that literary work.
Yeah, one might even suppose, one might be even more radical. And since, as Carola was saying, what we learn about Godot derives from what the 2 other characters say, we are not even certain that there is such a character, right? Or that is just a figment of their imagination, so to speak. So if we wonder whether in the story Godot exists or not, maybe the answer is probably left by Beckett himself open, just as in the case of Henry James we described before. Are there ghosts in The Turn of the Screw or not? Maybe it's just so, the story is so indeterminate that it is not even sure there is a character, but we do not even know whether it exists or not in the story.
So, I mean, just to put a sort of connection to the previous question, in this case, what happens is that the story tells us there's a character, there's someone, Godot, Vladimir and Estragon are waiting, but we do not know if in the story this is supposed to be seen as an existent individual or not, because maybe they are just waiting no one, and they just invented this character just to give a reason for their existence or for their being there on that solitary street.
Okay, I have a question which is a kind of continuation of the previous one. So what do you think, what determines which properties of fictional objects we can complement or additionally add as, say, readers? For example, Sherlock Holmes is a detective, so he is a human being, so he has human DNA, although his DNA is not mentioned anywhere in Conan Doyle's works. And moreover, DNA has not yet been discovered at the time of writing stories about Sherlock Holmes. Is this reasoning correct, or can we not deduce such a property? How about an alternative story about Sherlock Holmes, from which we suddenly learn that he is not a man from Earth, but an alien? At least, how can we know that Conan Doyle meant a human detective and not an alien one? So what determines which properties of fictional objects we can complement or presuppose or suppose? Are there any such factors?
Yeah, we think that in order to, so to speak, complement a fictional character with properties that are not explicitly ascribed to it, we have, so to speak, to rely on all the principles that we can mobilize, right? So, for instance, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, we definitely mobilize the reality assumption in order to say that Sherlock Holmes is a human being, even if we suppose that Doyle never writes explicitly anything about that. Do we have also to ascribe in the property of having a certain DNA? That depends on whether we use the reality assumption or whether we use the belief assumption, which is another assumption that can be used. That is the fact that we can implement the character depending on the belief that were widespread in the community of readers and writers at the time in which the story was written, right? So it might be the case that, for instance, since at that time people already believed in chemistry, certain properties having to do with chemistry and biology can be ascribed to Sherlock Holmes as well. But if we go back, say, to Ulysses or Achilles or characters in the Homer novels, maybe we might be more uncertain as to whether we can ascribe to Ulysses or Odysseus a certain DNA, precisely because if we have to stick to the beliefs of people at that time, probably, of course, they had no belief whatsoever about biology. They probably had the beliefs that have to do with some sort of credence in supernatural effects of even natural beings. So in that case, we should probably ascribe different properties because we would mobilize different principles.
Okay, thank you. So are there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your interesting paper. As far as I can see, all the exemplifications of your conceptions are belonging to the realm of fiction literature. But there are fictions in some other spheres. For instance, there are legal fictions. Did you try to apply your interesting conception of fictions to jurisprudence? For instance, the territory of the United States Embassy in Italy is Italian, but according to the international law, it's the territory of the United States. It's strange for grassroots, but according to law, it's American territory, and even the territory of the car carrying American ambassador moving is the territory of the United States, and crossing the door of that car is just crossing the border of the country. It's a fiction. Did you try to apply your interesting conception to this sphere?
Not yet. That would be very interesting to do. But as far as we understand your examples, maybe they do not involve sort of correspondence of fictional characters in legal matters, but just real individuals that have, so to speak, something like institutional properties that can be considered in a sense to be fictional, or at least they are not concrete, right? There is not a sense according to which, for instance, an animal can cross border, because for animals there are no borders. Of course, borders are there only for humans, as we all know, right? And in a sense, being a border, as in the example of the embassy that you gave, might be considered to be a sort of property that is ascribed to something in a fiction, but that does not eo ipso mean that the individual to which this property is ascribed is a fictional character. To give you a famous example, by getting back to Napoleon in Tolstoy War and Peace, right? Many people say that the Napoleon of War and Peace is the real French emperor, to which, of course, Tolstoy ascribes also properties that the real Napoleon did not have at all, like having met some prince in Russia, for instance, right? And perhaps this is similar to the case that you were pointing out.
And there is also another, I mean, the author, the reference author, in order to answer your question, would be Feinger and the Philosophie des Arts Sob. But I mean, think also about what happens to an actress like Isabelle Huppert when she plays the role of Madame Bovary. Of course, she remains a real person, Isabelle Huppert, but she somehow plays the role of a fictional entity. So what happens in some of the examples you have brought in your question is that you have an entity which is, for instance, in a country, but there is an additional property added to this real entity in a real country, which is that of being the embassy of a country which is somewhere else. And so, I mean, you need somehow decide how to ontologically and metaphysically describe this richer entity than the one you had at the beginning. Of course, these are somehow more complex entities than the one which are merely fictional. In the case of Napoleon, brought by Alberto in remembering Tolstoy's War and Peace, this is particularly interesting also as far as interpretation is concerned, because this is a wonderful example, not only because there is a real individual we find in a literary work, and so we need to decide how to consider this entity. Is it a real entity or not? For instance, according to us, it is not a real entity. It is a literary entity, exactly as it is a literary entity, Moscow or St. Petersburg, and so on and so forth, when when we find them in Tolstoy's works. Of course, they have important connections with the real ones that the reader is supposed to grasp somehow. But it has to do with interpretation, because, for instance, if you take the description you can find in a historical book written by French people describing Napoleon and giving Napoleon, and you read the description of Napoleon you find in Tolstoy, then you see that the character is not really, it does not really has contradictory properties as the one we can find, for instance, in Sherlock Holmes and the one yes, but you have difficulty in understanding how to match these interpretations, because Tolstoy describes Napoleon in a way which is somehow, I would say, the Russian perspective on Napoleon, which is different from the one the French people had on that very same individual, which had an historical role in their history. So, but this is an important point we need to work more on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? So, as I can see, there are no questions. So let's thank our plenary speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.